Welcome to the Washington Week Extra. I'm Amna Nawaz. We are continuing our conversation on the end of the Trump presidency and the beginning of Biden's, with 4 reporters covering it all. Laura Barron-Lopez is White House correspondent for Politico. Errin Haines is editor-at-large for The 19th. Anna Palmer is founder of Punchbowl News and the host of the Daily Punch podcast. And Ashley Parker is White House bureau chief for The Washington Post. Welcome back to you all, and thank you for bearing with us in what I know have been some trying technical difficulties. I want to open by saying I think it's fair to say we may not fully understand this moment in time, this 1 week in Washington, for years to come. Each of you are writing the chapters of history in real time, so I'd really love to step back and zoom out a bit and hear how each of you are processing and reflecting on this time in American history. So Errin, let's start with you. You look back over this week, we saw the historic swearing in of the first Black woman, the first South Asian woman, the first generation American woman as vice president, just weeks after white supremacists were among those who stormed the Capitol. How are you reconciling this moment right now?
Yeah, and listen, Amna, no worries. 2021 has already been full of technical difficulties, if you know what I mean. So, what I would say, I would actually back up to January 5th. I'm a native Georgian, and on January 5th, I was watching the Senate runoffs that were also historic in my home state. And, really thinking about the idea of those runoffs coming down to an issue of voter suppression versus voter turnout. I mean, regardless of who the candidates were and regardless of who what the outcome was, the idea that voter suppression was defeated on January 5th was something that was really striking to me. And so, to see, less than 24 hours later, both the highs and lows of our democracy captured was really, I think, says a lot about where we are, where we continue to be as a country in terms of our divided democracy, our divided electorate. To see, yes, a Black woman, woman of Asian American descent, the first woman to become the second most powerful person in the country. But at the same time, her leaving the Senate leaves no Black women in the Senate. Only 2 in the Senate's history. This is the push and pull of our democracy. This is the push and pull of race in America. Even as she, swore in this week, the first Latino senator from California, the first Black senator from Georgia, and the first Jewish senator from Georgia, and the youngest senator to ever serve, the youngest senator since Joe Biden. So, I mean, it just really, America is often, just a collection of contradictions, and that was certainly true and certainly on display this week, even as we saw history being made.
Ashley Parker, what about you? First, tell us where and how were you watching the inauguration, and then what has struck you about the way that this week has unfolded?
So I was watching the inauguration from home, unfortunately, as I do most things these days during quarantine. But living in DC, there was sort of a surreal split screen where on my television I could see the fireworks in one eye, and then out my window I could see them above the National Mall out of my other eye. And as you mentioned, reporters write the first draft of history, but in some ways you do kind of have to pause and take a moment to step back. Because as a journalist, I was finishing up my time as a Trump beat reporter and, working long days, right? How is the president going to leave the White House? Is he going to leave the White House? Is he going to leave with some modicum of grace? Is he going to say something inappropriate again? And as soon as that's over, you're suddenly the Biden beat reporter. And the one thing I'll just say, the one moment that was interesting to me is I have 2 daughters, a 9-year-old stepdaughter and a 2-year-old. There just was sort of a moment that forced me to step back to realize that, my older daughter will have really not known a world that didn't have a Black president to begin with, and then a female vice president who is also a person of color, and my 2-year-old who turned on election day certainly will only world. So regardless of politics or ideology, something that is very exciting for them, at least the older one, and that we sort of discuss not as journalists, but as citizens at our dinner table.
Laura, I saw you were live blogging the inauguration with some of your colleagues. What were you noticing as the day was unfolding, and what stayed with you since then?
Right. Well, I think one of the biggest things that stayed with me was elements of Biden's inauguration speech, which was the scope of it that he was trying to bring to bear about the difficulties the country is facing right now. And so when he was talking about unity, he was referring to unity in battling and confronting white supremacy, rising extremist threats, and domestic terror. And he was talking about uniting to face the anger and the resentment that has clearly built up in this country, and rising to face the fact that the majority of one party's voters believe that he's an illegitimate president. He didn't explicitly address that, but he was talking about this larger scope of the difficulties that the country is facing. Finally reckoning with the cry for justice, he said, after from the beginning of the country for 400 years dealing with slavery and racial inequity. And so that is what he was hitting when he was talking about unity. And it still is a big question about whether or not Democrats, whether or not Republicans explicitly are going to join him in trying to battle those rising white supremacist threats, in actually confronting and holding themselves accountable and deciding whether or not they are going to move in a different direction as a party, or they are going to stay with Trump and with people and whether or not they're also going to stay in trying to encourage voters who believe that this was an illegitimate election. Whether they'll continue down that line or actually tell their voters and their supporters that Biden was a legitimately elected president, and that it's time to move forward together to address the different confrontations.
Anna, this is what is so jarring about this moment and the way this unfolded, right? In some ways, the inauguration ceremony is exactly what you'd expect. There's the bunting and the flags and the ceremony and so on. But it was everything outside of the west front of the Capitol that was so surreal in many ways. What struck you about the way the handover happened and everything that's happened since?
Well, I've spent the vast majority of my career inside that building as a reporter. And so I think it's, even as somebody who's done that, the real processing of the fact that there was a siege on the Capitol, I do think it was powerful to see a week later, on the next Wednesday, that democracy reigned, that the peaceful transfer of power happened. But in the backdrop, you had social distancing. It was a very scarcely attended, and frankly, the other part that I think is just can't be felt enough unless you live in Washington. I live on Capitol Hill. I work in the Capitol. The security and just the tension around whether or not there was going to be another security incident or not. The fact that there has been, guard troops that are sleeping on the floor of the Capitol is just underscores this issue that just because Biden is now president, problems of this country remain. They're deep and they're significant. And I wonder how we can move away from the state and get back to bringing some unity, like the president talked about, around moving forward, getting through the pandemic, the economic crisis. But certainly for me, it was wonderful to see the fact that you had Republicans, you had Democrats, you had the new president at the Capitol say, we are going to do business, and no one is going to do that.
Errin, Haines, I want to get back to something you mentioned earlier, which was a recent conversation you hosted with the senior communications members of the Biden administration's team, the first all-female senior comms team, we should mention, which is another little bit of history they've made. But when it comes to how we as journalists, we as reporters do our jobs right now, there's a concern I want to ask you about, that we could slip into complacency, that this return to a somewhat normal relationship, less overtly adversarial when you're not being called fake news or the enemy of the people, that that could allow journalists to slip into some complacency. What do you make of that concern, and how do you protect against it?
Well, Amna, what I would say is that this is not a moment for us to be complacent as a political press corps, and I think that President Biden and Vice President Harris, in laying out these four crises of the pandemic, the economy, climate change, and racial inequality, any one of those issues would be heady fodder for a political journalist to cover. But you have to stay on top of the four of those issues, and to hold this administration accountable on all four of those fronts is certainly enough to keep any one of us, much less the entire press corps, busy for the next 4 years. And so, I think, the work is there. And for those of us who want to do it, whether we are coming from legacy and storied institutions like the Washington Post or PBS NewsHour, or whether it's newbies like us at the 19th, or Anna with Punchbowl and Laura with, Politico, it really is, taking the lessons that we have learned as a political press corps in, our recent political history. This new administration does present a new opportunity to really look at, just the stories and the narratives that we have the potential to tell as a political press corps about who and where we are as a country, and what this administration is doing, not only for the people that elected them, but for the people who didn't.
Ashley Parker, what about that? We should turn to you here now. You're the newly minted bureau chief, we should say, at the Washington Post. What are you telling your reporters? What's the mission statement?
Well, it's the exact same as it was covering President Trump. We will cover President Biden as rigorously and authoritatively and fairly as we covered President Trump before him, President Obama before him, and every president to come. And I think, to answer your original question, that is one of the ways we keep ourselves from slipping into complacency. Biden is a different president. He presents different challenges and different opportunities and is facing different crises, but sort of the general mission of the work stays exactly the same. And at the Post, and I believe with just about every other news organization, for instance, when Trump became president, we upped our White House team to 6 people at the beginning of his presidency. That was a historic number, and we ended it with 7. And we are beginning Biden with 7 people, again, and the same systems in place, the same on-call rotations, the same mandate stories. And I know that this is not the only organization doing that. I think we are the rule far more than the exception.
There's a lot of work for sure to be done ahead. We do it without fear or favor, and it's a privilege. It's a privilege to speak with all of you tonight, too. We're going to leave our conversation there for now. Many, many thanks to Laura, to Errin, Anna, and Ashley for being here. Thank you to all of you for joining us as well. Please make sure you sign up for our Washington Week newsletter. That's on our website. We'll give you a behind-the-scenes look into all things Washington. I'm Amna Nawaz. For now, good night from Washington.